So thank you again all for being here today. You may be seeing a brand new face to you. Usually it's Lori Grinya, our president and owner of HR Answers. That's usually with you, or Deborah, or one of our other consultants. I am Rebecca Valles, one of the other senior consultants. Been with HR Answers going on about 2 years now. And most of my experience has been in Oregon state government, but have worked with the university system and for several private companies. So bring a lot of consulting experience to the table. But today we're going to talk about records and retention, which I think we all have touched in some form or fashion over our time in our HR career. So just wanted to give you a quick overview. I'm going to share my screen here with you in a moment with kind of the information we'll go over. But just wanted to open up the chat. If you have questions as we go through, again, just pop them in there and we'll answer as many as we can as we go through our time together. Again, thank you for being a part of HR Answers Lunch Bunch today. Again, we're going to get started with our topic. And I'm going to just start off by sharing a screen just to show you the items that we're going to cover. For us today, we're going to take away three main components from today's conversation that we'll have together. And that will be around what documents to keep, how long do we, where do we keep them, and how long do we keep them? And so I think those are pretty standard things, but at the same time, I think it feels a little bit like a very large scope. And so we want to make sure that people get a good understanding. And again, feel free to pop things in the chat as we go through. Our records and retention, again, the first part that we'll really talk about is really around how to keep up to date with those records. And I've got several points that are listed here just to stay focused. We're going to go through each one of these, but wanted to also make sure that there was opportunity for conversation about it. Because I'm wondering just in the group as a whole, if you want to pop your responses in the chat, I'm just curious how many people have a designated person within their group or their company or their organization that is solely responsible for records retention, archiving, and the records destruction once you get to their point in the actual retention schedule. Anybody have a dedicated person to that, or do you have someone in your organization or multiple people in the organization that a lot of people are responsible for it? What do we have out there? One person. Thank you, Angela. Others? One person, multiple. Okay. Very good. All right. Good. So that's really good to know, because I think each client and each organization is going to do it a little bit differently. And I think some of these points that we'll cover today really helps to just remind us of things that help us to get through this records process and why they're so important. One is to stay organized. And I think having a clear filing system of knowing this is exactly where records are kept, and that it's a clear understanding whether it's hard copy records, physical hard copy records, or whether it is digital records. And we'll talk a little bit about the IT side of this records retention as well, because that's a lot of this. You'll want to get to some standard naming conventions, especially if we're going to store things electronically, as well as that will also help when we get to the record retention schedule and you're getting to the place where you're wanting to really start to look at those electronic records for when they're ready to come off of the rolls and be destroyed appropriately. So that's one way. So having either a consistent filing hard copy structure or a consistent electronic structure is going to be really key. The other key point that makes all of this go round and round is really having a record retention policy. And most most governance is around, and we have some ideas later in the presentation or in our conversation about what's recommended. But I think it's good to note that for our government entities, public entities of any kind, those are very much spelled out by the Secretary of State Archives Division. Depending on what size of organization and what type of government organization or public organization you may be. Those are pretty well spelled out in those Oregon administrative rules. And so we can send a link as follow-up to where you would be able to locate those. For our private sector and nonprofits, you're really going to want to look at some of the suggestions we have for records retention, as well as what your own policies or governance may be that for your organization. And that way we can keep consistent that because we have a policy, then we can still go through and be consistent with the application. Also, understanding some entities may have legal requirements. When you're in doubt, always refer to legal counsel who may be able to guide you in that process. The use of electronic management software. This is also another great tool. I know many of the organizations who are online with us today, many of you have HRIS systems that actually have a records management component or portal to it. And that makes everything so much easier because you can take your records retention policy and then apply those standards as rules within your system. And then it will automatically be able to help you to understand when those records, they will probably send you a notification to let you know these are eligible for destruction based on the archiving retention rule. And then you would be able to manage those for appropriate destruction at that time. So it gives you a great reminder, and it also is set up on that the retention schedule. And yes, Evelyn, I will be sending out this document at the end of our time together today, as well as other things we talk about that may be useful to the group. The secure access to records. This one comes up quite a bit, as not so much. It comes up in our physical records. Most of the time, physical records for the HR components are kept in the HR office or in an HR secured file cabinet or cabinets, which have locking mechanisms, which are very important. We don't want folks who aren't authorized to be accessing personnel records that may have personal identifying information on them. As well as on our digital side, we want to make sure when we give folks access, when they're coming or when they're leaving, we want to make sure that we manage those accesses to files and to systems appropriately with our security measures on our sensitive data. Things we want to document is the employee life cycle. So there will be many types of records that we'll talk about later on that will cover from the start. There's a recruitment file and everything that happened that regenerated that person to be hired as the successful candidate, all the way through their onboarding to their performance throughout their tenure with the organization, through any type of progress of performance management. There are performance evaluations all the way through a termination. So personnel files in general cover many of those things, but we'll call out some specific areas where we want to keep those files separated. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Consistency and documentation. I have always found in my years in state government, at least, we always had a form that helped not only for us and HR, but for any other folks who were accessing files for any reason, say the employee making a request to see their file. We made a actual template of what would go in that file and what would go in each section so that we could be consistent amongst all the employee files in the organization. So we didn't have their hire letter in one portion and their performance evaluations over here, and in another file having it over here and over here. It just made sense to be consistent that we knew what went in each section of the file. So as staff changed and turnover happened, we could ensure that there was consistency in those in how the documents were actually filed. We're going to talk about regular updates to records. This usually takes place when you typically have employees who will fill out a whole bunch of onboarding paperwork when they're first hired. But we would recommend also to have those items regularly updated. I know some of them that we recommend for sure is to relook at the emergency contact form because they may have changed who they want contacted in case of an emergency. Also, just personal information, their cell phone number might have changed. They may have gotten a new email address or other types of information. They might have changed bank accounts. That would be another record would go with the payroll files. So we want to make sure that we look at those particular things, as well as we also want to make sure of that we're looking for, a lot of folks have people sign a policy acknowledgement that we've looked at the policies of the organization, maybe when we started, but have we re-reviewed them on an annual basis? We would look for that updated policy acknowledgement in there as well as an employee would move from one job to another, say they're promoted several times, you would want to see, again, back to that employee life cycle, we would want to see that movement from one job to the next. And if their job title changed, their salary changed, all of that information would be key to that piece, as well as the performance. We'll talk about disciplinary and performance management a little bit later because we want to have the outcomes of those be in the file, but not any type of investigation or anything like that. Another piece that could be in your personnel file would be training and compliance to keep HR in compliance with making sure that we understand what any changes in law and making sure we understand the records, the record keeping for those particular things, particularly like family medical leave and equal opportunity regulations that may change over time, which, as we all know, HR rules and laws change on a regular basis. I know we're all keeping track of those things. We'll move on to backup data. Again, key with your HR and your IT folks. If you have an electronics management system, this may be good to just touch base on, just to make sure we're doing a regular backup with all the cyber attacks and system failures that have happened over the years. Seems to be becoming more and more prevalent. Always like to know that we have an electronic backup and that's being done on a regular basis should you need to retrieve items that may have been lost or compromised. HR audit records are another piece that help to identify in our records management processes anything that may be missing or things that may have gone unnoticed over time or through just pure attrition from one person to another. And I always use the example from the HR audit of records. I know each time I went into a new organization within state government, that was the one thing I liked to do as a practice was to go in and do a file review. So I understood the landscape of where did things sit at the moment and were those pieces in compliance with what best practice would be about records management. And if we had the correct documentation and if they were being held in separate files and if they were being held for the right amount of time. So I always like to do that. And it's always helpful to do on a regular basis, especially as we have law changes, might be good to revisit as well. Data privacy and the general data protection regulations. Lots of stuff on privacy that are out in the laws and that are in best practices for ensuring that we're not inadvertently sharing data that is privacy or personally identifying information. So if there's ever a personnel records request, making sure we're working very closely with legal counsel on redacting out that personally identifying information so we can ensure that we stay in compliance. And I had mentioned this piece a little bit earlier, but providing access to employees. In some cases, an employee may request to take a look at their personnel file. And we want to make sure for that reason, as well as our own for being in compliance, that we have all the records that are associated with that employee's employment life cycle. That if they have a question or want to review, that we, one, have a good process in our policies describing how we go about doing that, who's responsible for accessing it and providing it to the employee, maybe a timeline associated with how quickly we will provide that, and those types of things. So it's always good to make those things available for the reason that it's really about that employee. So we want to freely share that information. Again, the things we'll talk about that we don't have in the personnel file would be things like anything related to the disciplinary fact-finding process. The outcome, yes, but the process by which you reach that result, no. Other things would be to train managers on documentation and what's typically kept. A manager will typically keep what we call a supervisory file, and that is typically separate from the personnel file. That may document when they've had coaching moments with that employee, or they have performance concerns that they may need to use as a part of developing a performance improvement plan, or potentially working with HR to actually help the beginning of a fact finding that may or may not lead to disciplinary actions. So that documentation that's kept in the supervisory file, again, very, very needed, very useful part of the records process. Disposing of records properly. Again, our records retention policy really guides the disposal of records, and whether we're using a secure document shredding company or whether we're permanently deleting digital files, need to make sure that our processes are secure and are in compliance with rules, laws, and policies that may be in effect for your organization. Staying informed of law changes. Again, we mentioned that a little bit earlier about how the laws and the rules have changed. Again, I know all of you are aware, we have new rules coming on board, with Paid Leave Oregon being one example of being able to keep documents appropriately. Again, most of that's being handled by either the employment department or outside third-party vendors. But just wanting to recognize how laws come on board and how we need to stay informed about those laws, rules, and changes that may come up. And if adjustments need to be made to retention policies to make them to retain items longer, then we would want to look at that at that time. And again, if ever in doubt, we always would recommend either reaching out to your legal counsel or to one of the senior consultants here at HR Answers, and we can help guide in that process. Again, legal counsel will always be the best bet on being able to ensure that we're set up in a good way should there be a call for a records hold where we have to produce them in litigation. So that's another key piece. We won't go into depths into that, but just wanted to mention it so that we have it on our viewfinders. So, but all of this to say that, records are a part of what really help us to move forward in all of our processes within in our HR role or in our organization, no matter what role we hold. It really is our best guide to being able to document. I know when I'm consulting with different clients, that's the one thing. Do we have that documented? And I know that's one of the pieces that a lot of you I've worked with over these last 2 years, and having documentation really helps. And as we work through the different scenarios that you come across in your workplace. So the other thing I would want to just talk about in general, again, a survey poll for the group to just say, before we talk about basic retention outlines, I'm assuming this is the answer, but I just want to hear from the group. Do you typically have all of your employee records for one employee and one file? Or are they broken out into multiple files, like the personnel file, payroll records, tax records, which we'll talk about kind of the whole scope. But how many are just one file for all, and how many have multiples? If you can just throw it in the chat. I'm assuming everybody's going to say multiples, but just want to get an idea. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. We're this is a great group. Payroll and HR. Okay. Good. Okay, good. Everybody's kind of saying multiples. So that's good. That's great. Great job, everybody. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And I think the piece to take away from this part of the interaction is to say, Samantha, yeah, it always seems like there's more, right? And we'll talk about the different types of files. And we do have some recommended retention periods on here. But again, I don't want to lose sight for our public entities to make sure you go back and reflect on what is in the Secretary of State Archives Division rules. And as a follow-up, I'll send this list as well as the link to the archive rules just for our public entities, so you have that as an idea. For our public, or for our private and our nonprofits, again, this is a guide, and again, want to be specific and consistent with what you've done in the past. So the typical is that personnel file, which really talks about that life cycle of an employee. And we are looking at, hire letters, employment contracts, their resume, their job application, performance evaluations, as they've promoted over time, if they've had any type of issued discipline, those issued disciplines that are in writing would be in the personnel file, because that would be the outcome. We don't put the process, we just put the outcome in the personnel file. And we would have their separation or their termination once they resigned or retired from the organization. That would also be in there, along with maybe their training records. Some may have the training records separately, but typically that's going to be retained for the entire duration of their employment, and then potentially 3 to 7 years after they've terminated or separated from your organization as a guide. One of the things I will say, as far as when we're talking about personnel files and employment contracts, kind of that upfront onboarding data, the only thing that I will call out, and I just want to double check myself that I have them recognized here, but I just want to call this out really quickly, because I think that's kind of at the beginning of when we have an employee start, that's a very typical form. Every employer is filling out an I-9 within those first 3 days of employment. And we want to be certain that those I-9 forms are kept separate from the personnel file. The I-9 should be kept in a separate folder, binder, secure location, away from the personnel files. These do have very sensitive personal identifying information on it. It has social security numbers, birthdays, potential driver's license, passport information, a lot of information on there. We want to make sure that we have kept secure. I'll just use my example. When I was an HR manager out in a state agency, I actually had a separate locking file cabinet in the conference room behind a locked door for just the I-9s, just to keep those super secure, because of the information that was kept on those. Most employers, I'm going to go back up to our personnel files. Most employers have decided over time to move away from having the social security number as an identifier for an employee. Usually we have an employee number of some type, or a truncated of just the last 4 digits of the social security number. We just want to make sure that our personnel files are secure, as well as these I-9s, which have very specific information depending on what acceptable document was used by the employee to show that they're eligible to work in the United States. So just wanted to call out the I-9s in particular as a definite separate file from the personnel file. Another file that would be typically in our payroll and benefits section. Sometimes those are part of HR, sometimes they're separate. But just want to make sure that the payroll records of things that are any changes to their timesheet, their W-4, any type of reporting on wages, that would be kept in a separate file. If you keep an electronic, again, same thing on the records retention. Again, usually retained 3 to 7 years. Again, specific requirements may apply if you're a public entity. Another one would be tax records. That would be that W-4 or that W-2. Anything to do with tax related items, again, that would have a retention period of at least 4 years, but again, may vary. If you have any questions specifically on tax or payroll records, another great resource may also be the person who is your tax accountant or any payroll offices that you use that are outside third party. They may have also some good retention schedules for you to follow if you're not a public entity. Our benefits and retirement records, again, those are also kind of put together with our payroll and tax. Our benefits, retirement, all of those records are usually also kept in a separate file. And again, it will depend on the retirement plan that you have. May be dependent and may be in the plan documents for those benefit plans or for the retirement plans. Again, I would check with your carriers to see if they have any recommended retention schedules for the years while they're employed within you, and then how many years after termination to retain those records. Again, we've talked about the I-9 form. I think that was pretty good as far as let me know if you have any questions on that. I do have some questions in the chat. I'm going to break off to those really quick. Mandy, will you talk about storage and retention of medical and protected leave records? Yes, I believe I have that. I don't have that one in the list, but it's coming up on number 6, and we will talk about that. And Liana, what are recommendations of now that I-9s can be completed through HRIS? Again, for your HRIS systems, making sure that folks, if you have the ability to grant individual access to different modules, you may want to check with your IT folks or your HRIS administrator to see if there is different modules, and if you can set up access, whether it's view only or if it's restricted access just to the HR shop for the different modules. So that may be something you want to check. Jennifer's asking about payroll records. Is timeline you have during employment or after employment? It would be for both. So again, I would, if you're a public entity, those Secretary of State archive rules really call that specific piece out. Again, if you're private or nonprofit, I would maybe look at, for any of you, I would recommend looking at the state archive rules just to give you an idea, even if they're not applicable to you, to see what's best practice. But for the payroll records, I would definitely say during employment, absolutely, and after employment for a period of time, especially if there's any discrepancies, maybe 3 to 5 years. But again, we can check those in the archive rules just to see as a guide, depending on if you're a public employer or not. Mandy, to talk about your medical and health records, that one very specifically, there may be multiples, especially we'll talk about family medical leave as one. We can also talk about it from the perspective of any ADA accommodations. Even though not a protected leave, it is a protection for our folks who are disabled. We want to make sure that we're keeping that interactive process records and accommodations that have been discussed, granted, implemented, or not implemented. We want to keep those in a separate file. Again, nothing in the personnel file about that. Any drug testing, workers' comp claims, again, all of those pieces should be kept in a separate file because each one of those potentially may have a separate record retention, again, based on whether or not you're a public entity or not. Again, but they should be retained for as long as the local regulations require. Termination records. These are typically documents, termination or separation. After, if an employee sends you a letter saying, "Hey, I've been here for 30 years, I'm going to retire now," that's definitely something you would want to see in the personnel file. Maybe their exit interview, as far as these records. If you're actually terminating someone through a documentation, through a disciplinary performance review process. Again, like I've said before, the process by which you went through to get to an outcome would be in a separate fact-finding or disciplinary folder. If you have a termination letter, that would go in the actual personnel file. And again, that's often retained for several years post-termination. Training and development records, those, again, depending on the size of your organization, sometimes they're kept in a personnel file. Sometimes this is where that HRIS system is really good as well, because it typically will have a training module in HRIS that will help to track and keep those training records for an individual or their training goals. Those would all be in that particular module. They could be hard copy as well. Again, we're definitely going to be retaining those for the duration of their employment, and those may have more of a limited period of retention post-retirement or post-separation or termination. So you'll want to look at what makes sense for your organization. Again, I know I've said it a million times already, but our public organizations really want to take a look at those archival rules from Secretary of State on that piece. We touched a little bit on performance appraisals and disciplinary records. Again, the disciplinary actions, performance evaluations are good to be in the personnel file. That's typically not the process by which you end up down a discipline road. It might identify things that need improvement, but you're going to be walking down a different road that will be contained in a different file if we actually lead to an actual disciplinary action that results in a written document of a written reprimand or a salary reduction or a demotion or something of that nature, that's moving the employee from one status to another, what have you. Your performance improvement plans would be in the personnel file as well. Again, that would be typically, and one of the things I haven't mentioned through this process has been sometimes, especially disciplinary records of how you reached a decision about a disciplinary action may be outlined if you do have, if you're in an organization that has a collective bargaining agreement. So be very mindful to check the labor laws and the different collective bargaining agreements if you have it, to make sure that you're retaining, because some disciplinary letters that are retained, they may have a duration of like 3 years in the personnel file and then they're removed. So just be mindful of any things that may be governing your organization, and make sure that we have that clearly identified in that records retention policy that I was mentioning earlier. Very key to stay on top of that. One of the other questions I just wanted to, please feel free to throw more questions in the chat, but I do have another group question for all of you. How many of you have a records retention policy in place currently? Good. I'm hoping to see all the hands go up on this one. Yes. Yay. Very good. Okay. Good. Okay. Yep. Not formal. Okay. Okay. Very good. I think that's our best place to start, is identifying what records we have. And most of them we kind of have outlined here, and really writing down what's our schedule. How many of you have a set time of the year that you review your records retention schedule to say, okay, we need to go through and purge documents? How many of you have a reminder? When do you do it? The beginning of January, or is it a certain time each year? This time of year? Okay. Yes, January. Okay. Just wondering about where that reminder comes in. You do it on the fiscal year. Okay, good. End of the fiscal year, annually, end of fiscal year. Okay, because I know some government entities are they follow the federal fiscal year. Some follow the state fiscal year, which is July 1 to June 30. So each maybe follows a different one. When I find the time, okay, yeah, yeah. So I think records is really good. I would just have one caveat on why it's really important to follow your records retention policies, is that, over time you want to keep what you need to keep legally, and you also want to be able to be responsive should those requests for those records be brought forward. And sometimes I've had in particular litigation cases where documents that have been retained too long could potentially be negative or harmful versus them being retained and then destroyed at the appropriate times as per your policies. Because as all of you know, first thing we always ask about is what's in your employee handbook and have we been following what that says. And so this is no different. There is implications, and what we're looking for is just consistency. So whatever that would look like for your organization, putting reminders. I know just the simple things of I have on my reminder list for me personally, to remember to change the air cleaner filter in my air conditioner every year, just those types of things. That's kind of like archival retention. It's just making sure we're checking that policy. Again, I can't say enough about how HRIS systems will help in that, giving you notification and having those key retention schedules already built in. So it gives you alerts on when particular documents are ready for those appropriate destructions. The other piece would be, how do we typically, once we've identified documents that need to be destroyed based on our schedule, what's your typical method? Do you typically write down what you've destroyed and then shred it? Or what's your typical process? Or do you just shred and not keep record? What's the typical out there? Throw them in the chat for me. Make a list and shred. Very good. Just shred. Okay. Destruction form and list. Very good. Group by year. Very good. How many use a professional shredding company to do that work on your behalf, or do you do it in-house? Okay. Yep. Make a list, shred. Great. Yep. Excellent. Yep. And one of the components for using a professional shredding is they will have security protocols. When we got back to that data privacy and that governance, not only while we're retaining it, but it's really important to remember that when we're destroying them, to make sure that there's not something left that somebody can go and map all the pieces and paste them all back together and try to do that. But where do you got a question in the chat? Where do you save the list of what you shred? So typically, you would use a standardized naming convention of the year. If it's personnel records, who the file was for, or what records, you can say performance evaluations from this year to this year. You can make a list, and then that way you can be consistent on how you name them when you make your list. And then the list that you have, you can just keep a file on your electronic drive marked confidential. You can maybe password protect the list. That way just your HR or your senior executives have access to view whatever the appropriate level of access would be in your organization. And again, IT may be able to also help with that, or setting up a separate file folder that has specific access for only certain and appropriate folks to access. So not top secret information, but we do want to make sure, as with all records, that the appropriate parties have access and the other folks do not. Because again, we want to make sure that that data privacy and governance of records that we're the custodians of through the process, and we want people to feel very confident in us that we're retaining and destroying in an appropriate manner that honors that compliance with the data privacy and governance. So other questions for us? We still have some time, about 18 minutes or so. Other questions I can answer for you about records. I'm sure there's much more that can be spoken about for records, but want to give you a chance to pop in with your questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now and just see what else we have and see all of your beautiful faces out there. Other questions? Other thoughts to share? Any good processes you have in place that you want to share with the group? Okay. Well, everybody's been great today. Thank you so much for participating. Not seeing any other questions coming from the group, but again, you know how to reach us here at HR Answers. I do have one coming in from Evelyn around the I-9s, but ID for I-9s, should those be kept separately? Those should be kept with the I-9 document itself. And again, that's going to be kept in a separate folder in a separate file cabinet with a lock and key around it. So we want to make sure we keep those, but those would be kept directly with the I-9 form as the supporting documents for the acceptable documents that they've provided that are on the list. Let's see. We have some more. Are you going to share a sample policy? I can get that for you as well, Jennifer. Thank you, Evelyn. You may comment that you only need to keep I-9s for 3 years while they're working and not until they leave. Is that correct? I think I-9s are retained. They're definitely retained for their duration of their employment with you. I'll have to double check on the duration after they've terminated. Because the Homeland Security rules are very specific about that particular retention. And so as we go through, like we talked about with many things, there may be different guidelines that govern each particular thing. So we want to make sure we're in compliance with that. But Luann, I'll make sure to include that in the follow-up as well. Do you have a copy of the ID for the I-9? I can send out the acceptable documents that goes with the I-9. In fact, I believe they just approved a new I-9 form this last year or this last few months, and I'll make sure to send that in there as well. I-9s, Becca Fina, yeah, are retained 3 years from the date of hire and then 1 year. Thank you, Becca. Appreciate that. Didn't have that at my fingertips, so thank you so much. Your document said I-9s 3 years while employed. Jefferson longer. Okay. Yeah. And I think that's what Susan, I think that's what Becca's saying, but I'll double check it. And if there's any adjustment, I'll make that on the slide and send out the new I-9 form that's out there as well. When I send out the follow-up, I'm responding to Lauren's question in the chat. Lauren, when I send it out, I will send out a printable document that you can print out. Yes, it'll be a Word document or a PDF. Very good. More questions? It's been so great being with all of you during our lunchtime together. Thank you so much. Again, you know how to reach us here at HR Answers. You can call our direct number is 503-885-9815. If you want to reach me specifically, I'm at extension 231. Or you can also reach us at info@hranswers.com. Again, whatever the question, just let us know, whether it's records, retention, or other things. Always glad to help and always glad getting information out and sharing together the great practices everyone has in place already and just staying freshened on all the new things that are coming our way on a constant basis. So thank you so much. And again, any more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. If not, enjoy the rest of the day and make it a great week.